Bernie went on the floor of the Senate and he let the chip companies have it. I mean, these are guys that make billions and billions of dollars. They ship our jobs overseas. They go ahead and take all our intellect that was created by universities and other public entities, package it up, and just a few make a big profit off of it. And then they come begging for money. Oh, you want us to come back and build in the United States? Help, help us build. Really?
I recently came across a very, very interesting interview that the CEO of Intel, Mr. Pat Gelsinger, did last Friday on CNBC's Squawk Box. And I think that interview that he did tells us everything that we want to know about the American oligarchy, about corporate arrogance, and the state of American politics. And this is what Mr. Gelsinger said last Friday, and I quote, Mr. Gelsinger, head of Intel, quote, "My message to congressional leaders is, hey, if I'm not done with the job, I don't get to go home. Neither should you." He's talking to Congress. Do not go home for August recess until you have passed the CHIPS Act, because I and others in the industry will make investment decisions. And do you want those investments in the U.S., or are we simply not competitive enough to do them here, and we need to go to Europe or Asia for those? Get the job done. Do not go home for August recess without getting these bills passed. End of quote. That's Pat Gelsinger, head of Intel, last Friday. In other words, Mr. President, the CEO of a major corporation, which made nearly $20 billion in profits last year, and a CEO who received a $179 million compensation package, is saying to Congress that if you don't give my industry, the microchip industry, $76 billion, and my company, it is estimated, some $20 or $30 billion, that despite their profound love for our country and their respect for American workers and their understanding of the needs of the U.S. military and the healthcare industry, despite all of that, in order to make more profits, they are prepared to go to Europe and Asia. Now, Mr. President, I am thankfully not a lawyer, but that sure sounds like extortion to me. What Mr. Gelsinger is saying is that if you don't give the industry a blank check, here's $76 billion, and they want more, by the way, despite the needs of the military for advanced microchips, and we hear that from the military, despite the needs of the medical industry for advanced microchips, despite the entire needs of the American economy for advanced microchips, the industry is threatening to abandon this country and move abroad. Patriotic people, no doubt, clearly lovers of America. Mr. Gelsinger says we should stay in session, if necessary, through August in order to pass his legislation. Well, I think we might want to stay in session through August, but not necessarily to pass his legislation. Over the last 20 years, the microchip industry has shut down over 780 manufacturing plants in the United States and eliminated 150,000 American jobs while moving most of its production overseas. And they did that, by the way, after receiving $9.5 billion in government subsidies and loans. In other words, we have the absurd situation where we have a crisis that is caused precisely by the people we are now attempting to bail out. So as a reward for their bad behavior, for shutting down 780 manufacturing establishments in America, they come back and say, oh, we have a crisis in America. We need your help. So they want us to pay to undo the damage they caused. Well, that may make sense to someone, but not to me. In total, Mr. President, it has been estimated that 5 major semiconductor companies will receive the lion's share of this technology handout. Those companies are Intel, Texas Instruments, Micron Technology, Global Foundries, and Samsung. These 5 companies made $70 billion in profit last year. The company that will likely benefit the most from this taxpayer assistance is Mr. Gelsinger's company, Intel. Now, I have nothing against Intel, and I wish them the best, but Intel is not a poor company. Last year, Intel made nearly $20 billion in profit. During the pandemic, Intel had enough money to spend $16.6 billion, not on research and development, not on building new plants, but on buying back its own stock to reward its executives and wealthy shareholders. Over the past 20 years, Intel has spent over $100 million on lobbying and campaign contributions. Say $100 million may seem like a lot of money, but if you're about to get $20 billion from the taxpayers of America, that is a very modest investment. And meanwhile, while they spent $100 million on lobbying and campaign contributions, they were shipping thousands of jobs to China and other low-income countries. Does this really sound like a company that needs a taxpayer handout? Another company that would receive taxpayer assistance under this legislation is Texas Instruments. Last year, Texas Instruments made $7.8 billion in profits. In 2020, the company spent $2.5 billion buying back its own stock. Meanwhile, other companies that will receive taxpayer support are the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And by the way, you would be shocked to know that the largest shareholder of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is, well, you guessed it, it's the government of Taiwan. And so we'd be giving money, I guess, directly to the government of Taiwan. And on it goes. Mr. President, I should be clear in stating that I do believe in industrial policy. I think that at times it is absolutely appropriate for the government to sit down with the private sector and say, look, we have needs and we want to work with you to solve those needs. You have a right to make a fair profit. We have the right to see the needs of the American people addressed. We need a partnership. To me, industrial policy means cooperation between the government and the private sector, cooperation. It does not mean the government providing massive amounts of corporate welfare to profitable corporations without getting anything in return. So the question is, will the United States government develop an industrial policy that benefits all of our society, or will we continue to have an industrial policy that benefits the wealthy, the powerful, their lobbyists, and the campaign contributors? In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and I quote, "The problem is that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor," end of quote. I'm afraid that what Dr. King said 54 years ago was accurate back then, and it is even more accurate today. So, Mr. President, the Senate has an important decision to make, and that is, do we simply provide a blank check, or do we put some restrictions on that money? And that is why I will be offering an amendment which does that. It seems to me that if private companies are going to benefit from generous taxpayer subsidies, the financial gains made by these companies must be shared with the American people, not just wealthy shareholders. In other words, if microchip companies make a profit as a direct result of these federal grants, the taxpayers of this country have a right to get a reasonable return on that investment. Further, if microchip companies receive taxpayer assistance, they must agree that they will not buy back their own stock, outsource American jobs overseas, repeal existing collective bargaining agreements, and must remain neutral in any union organizing effort. This is not a radical idea. All of these conditions were imposed on companies that received taxpayer assistance during the pandemic and passed the Senate through the CARES Act by a vote of 96-0. And that is why I will be filing an amendment to impose these conditions to this legislation. Now, I understand, Mr. President, that some language has been inserted into this bill that would prohibit microchip companies from using these grants to buy back their own stock. But let us be clear. This language is totally meaningless. Under this legislation, companies will still be able to use the enormous profits that they are making on stock buybacks. Bottom line, let us rebuild the U.S. microchip industry, but let us do it in a way that benefits all of our people, not just a handful of wealthy, profitable, and powerful corporations.
Well, Bernie talked about something or specified something that we talk about over and over and over ad nauseum here at Politics Done Right. And that is, you guys created the problem, and now when it's time to solve it, you come begging for the American people to solve it for you, and then you repeat over and over again. So we're not going to have that with the CHIPS Act. We're not going to have that with the semiconductor companies if Bernie has his way and those who support him have their way. In other words, all right, we'll give you the $76 billion, but you can't buy back stocks. And we don't mean you can't use any of the $76 billion to buy back stock. We mean you can't buy back stock because money is fungible. Also, you can't mess with unions if they're trying to unionize the companies so that they can also take advantage of the spoils. And by the way, you can't ship those jobs overseas created with our money at all. It's the people's money. They deserve the jobs here. And the return on that investment that we are giving you, some of that comes right back into the coffers of the United States. You know what, folks? We should have done, every time the government gives subsidies to private companies, they should give subsidies as a percentage of the share value so that the government can make a profit on all the monies they give to these thieving corporations, because they take our money and then they decide we'll fire them. Always ask a capitalist this: how comes when the government invests in your company, they get no return? If a bank invests in your company, they get interest. If a venture capitalist company invests in your company, they get stock options. Why is it that the government who's investing in your company doesn't get the same as well? Folks, we have to wake up to the fraud. We have to wake up to the fraud that is our economic system and how it is in bed. It's conniving. It is in a corrupted way, acting with our own government, and we need to take government and make sure to do that which is right. We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number 1, subscribe to our channel. And number 2, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.